From the beginning of recorded history through May 6, 1954, the fastest any human being had ever run a mile was 4 minutes, 1 second, and 4/10 of a second. Runners from across the globe had been focused on breaking that barrier for nearly 70 years, all to no avail. The experts had long believed breaking the 4-minute barrier would require ideal running conditions. It would have to be in perfect weather, on a particular kind of track, and in front of a huge, boisterous crowd, urging the runner on to their best ever performance. But on May 6th, 1954, Roger Bannister had none of those things working in his favor. The day was cold, the track in Oxford was wet, and the crowd was small. On top of that, Bannister himself was hardly the picture of a singularly focused athlete, intent on breaking this imposing barrier. The bulk of his time was devoted to being a medical student. He didn't train like a maniac and sprint miles every day. He was notorious for doing the opposite. He trained for just 1 hour a day. Bannister did not go on to become the greatest middle distance runner in the world. Instead, he finished his studies and he became a neurologist. How did this happen? And why does it matter? Roger Bannister had faith in what was possible. What separated him from everyone else was that he believed he could do it. The current world record time for a mile sits at 3:43:13, set in 1999. I know you were dying to know that. Was there a sudden growth spurt in human evolution? Was there a genetic engineering experiment that created a new super race of runners? No. The answer to what Bannister had achieved was not physical. What changed was the mental model. The runners of the past had been held back by a mindset that was not serving them. The Roger Bannisters of the world ask themselves, if there were no limits, what would I do? What would I want to do in this lifetime? Colin O'Brady asked himself that very question. Colin is an American professional endurance athlete who has summited the well-known mountains of the world and completed a solo crossing on foot of Antarctica. Okay, it's hard to see ourselves in a Colin O'Brady, at least for me. I don't want to assume for the rest of you. But what he has to teach is actually for all of us. He asks us to consider, what if we were to dream without limits? Now, Colin was invited to give a speech to a bunch of wealthy Wall Street bankers at a very intimate dinner, about 8 people or so, in Manhattan. And he's this public school kid from Portland, not fancy. And he's wearing a black t-shirt and Jordans, and he shows up, and the doorman looks at him skeptically and says, if you're with catering, you need to take the service elevator. It gets sorted out. The doorman realizes he's a guest, and he sends him up to the penthouse. And there he finds a group of guys, mid-60s, and they're all in these custom suits and Patek Philippe watches. These guys are like big mockers on Wall Street. And they have a conversation about his experiences climbing Everest and solo crossing Antarctica. And finally, Colin says, you've been asking me these questions all night, and I want to know from you. What's your Everest? Is it this? You guys are obviously wildly successful. Is this what you've always dreamed about from when you were a kid? And in recounting the story, Colin says, I expected this ruckus response, but instead there was this awkward, noticeable moment of silence. So they finished dinner, And as everyone is leaving, the oldest guy at the table stops him and says, "Colin, can I speak to you privately?" Now, this man is super sincere. He's the soft-spoken guy, and he's super career successful. And he says to Colin, "You asked us an important question, and I'm embarrassed that none of us really gave you an answer, myself included. And ever since you asked that about an hour ago, I've just been sitting here thinking about this, and I don't know if I have an answer. I've made more money than you can possibly imagine in my life. But I used to go to the summer camp in the Catskills, and I used to sit on this rowboat in the middle of the camp lake when I was a teen. And there's not a day that goes by that my mind doesn't drift back to that moment when I was on that boat at summer camp. The simplicity of those days." In essence, he was saying, I've had all this external success, but I don't know that I'm fulfilled. And he never took the time to ask himself, well, what's possible? What was his Everest beyond making a ton of money? As kids, we believed we could be anything and do anything, largely because for a lot of us, that's what our parents told us. How frightening it is to consider that the ideas and feelings that used to motivate us, the very ones we based our lives on, are so buried that we no longer consider them a remote possibility. We don't even recognize them anymore. And yet we've based our lives on these ideas and feelings, and if we have to give them up, if we have to let them go, then what do we do with our lives after that? Do we have to burn it all down to the ground, or are there other options? Can we go on being a doctor if we don't have the same passion for healing that we used to? Can we continue to be a rabbi if all our theological assumptions have changed? Do we give it all up? Throw it all away? Determine having made millions is enough of an Everest? Even if it doesn't feel like one? Consider this story from the Midrash. It's from the rabbi's stories about the meaning of the Torah. It goes like this. There once upon a time was a woman, and she had a strong box, a treasure chest, where she kept her valuables. And on it there was a lock. And the lock broke in two. So, she did what you did in those days. She took the lock down to the local blacksmith. And she hands it over, the two pieces, to the blacksmith and says, "Can you fix it?" And the blacksmith looks over the two pieces and, tries to fit them back together. And he looks at her and says, "No, it can't be fixed." And then he pauses and he says, all the material for a lock is here. And so I can't fix it, but what I can do is I can take it and I can throw it into the forge, I can throw it into the fire, and I can recreate it. I can rebuild the lock. I have the technology. And if you got that joke, you are totally dating yourselves. I can recreate the lock. End of story. Now, the rabbis use this story as a metaphor for us. We are the lock. The moment in which problems seem intractable and irreparable, when relationships seem that way, what happens when things seem like they can't be fixed? You know what I mean? And there's a temptation to burn them down, blow them up, start over. But that's not what the teaching is saying. This teaching is saying, yeah, use the fire, but not as a destructive force. Use it as a creative force. So when you have a problem or a relationship that seems totally irreparable, you take it, you throw it into the forge, and you allow it to be recreated. You take the material of a broken past and you allow it to create the future. the future can be recreated. We can be recreated. And the nice thing about this lock in two pieces is that it aptly describes all of us in this way. There's a person in this world whom you adore. It's your father, mother, sister, brother, sibling, parent, spouse, friend. I don't know who it is, but you love them, and you admire them, and you respect them. And there's one thing they do that drives you so insane that you have cheerfully considered homicide. Can anyone relate? And because you love them, and you've thought about killing them, you've thought about it deeply, and you've come up with a solution to their problem, which is actually your problem. And you've come with a key to their problem with lots of "I feel" statements. And you come to them, and you presented this beautiful solution, and what you realize is they decline to accept your advice. And the problem isn't that you're not right. You're right. And they know you're right. And you know they know that you're right. And they know you know. The problem is that the two of you are a kind of lock. The way the two pieces fit together. The way you interact, it no longer fits. It's not the key, it's not the solution, but the lock that's broken. And really, this even describes the historical moment that we're in so many ways. What's a broken lock without a beautiful key? It's like a vaccine where there's no arm to put it in. It's like two political parties where there are no facts to be agreed upon. The problem isn't the solution or the key, it's the lock. It needs to be remade, recreated, reforged. It's possible. Just like there's healing that's waiting for us. But we can't always see how we're going to get there, so we don't believe it's possible. Because we don't have faith. And faith is just a word for belief in the possible that we can't yet see. A friend of mine was having a particularly hard time in her marriage. She was on a business trip and on the phone with her partner, and it was a really bad conversation. They hung up, and she didn't really know what to do. And for lack of anything better, she started to pray. And what came out of her mouth was, "I can't see it, but you can." She was talking to God. What she was talking about was the path that would take her where she needs to be for her relationship to be good and healthy. And she was saying, "I can't see it right now, but I know that you can." And more than her faith in a higher power was her admission that the higher power wasn't her. I'm not God. I know there is a perspective above what I can see. I know you have that sight. Please help me until I can see it myself. God says to Job, "Were you the one who tied the cord of the constellation Pleiades? Were you the one who loosened the belt of Orion?" And my friend was like, "Not me. That is way above my spiritual pay grade. I can't see from that high, but you can. Please help me." This is not thoughts and prayers. This is not giving up agency. This is having faith until the moment of agency comes. It's having a certain kind of fortitude. You don't have to believe in God in order to do this. What you have to believe in is that there is a perspective other than your own that can see what you cannot because it's just around the corner somewhere. It's like love. Can't see love, but we know when we feel it. We don't pray for God to make things happen for us, but we pray that we can access the strength within ourselves to make things happen for us. We tap into the faith that the possibility exists, even if we can't see it, especially when we can't see it. And we manifest it anyway. have a lot of articles of faith in Judaism, but one that we do have is pretty cool, and it's right in the morning service. Did you know that as Jews, we believe that the world is recreated from scratch, fresh, every morning? It's a crazy thing if you think about it, but it's right there in the text. Uvtuvo mechadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reshit. Daily, you renew creation. The world comes to be every morning. Things do not persist. They are given new reason to exist every single day. And if you can get your head around that, what you will see is that you can't ever say there's no possibility because perhaps the possibility just hasn't been created yet. But tomorrow morning, we start all over again. The joy that awaits you, the medicine for what ails you, it might not exist yet. Like the psalmist says, at night you might be crying in tears, but joy comes in the morning. There is always a possibility. Faith is believing in things unseen, not because they don't exist, but because they've not yet been born. To have faith is to have a possible mindset. It's to add the word yet to the end of our sentences. There's a plague of mass shooting violence in this country, and we haven't fixed it yet. I had a falling out with my best friend, and neither of us are able to apologize yet. I feel stuck in my job, and I can't seem to realize my potential yet. That one word, yet, takes us out of being victims. It gives us power and agency and possibility. Dr. Edith Ava Egger holds that in every moment, we make choices about what is possible and impossible for each of us. Her story about embracing the possible takes us to Budapest, where when Dr. Egger was just a teenage girl, she and her older sister and her two parents were arrested by the Nazis and sent in a cattle car to Auschwitz. Now, Edith and her sister miraculously survived the war. And with Viktor Frankl as a mentor and teacher, Edith came to believe that her painful experiences were not a liability, but a gift. That while we cannot help being victimized, it is we who choose to be victims. Victimization happens to us. It is we who choose to label ourselves as victims. Think about that for a moment. It's very powerful. Despite all that Dr. Egger endured, and she truly nearly died over and over again, she came to understand that we have the possibility within us to find meaning in suffering and turn it into an opportunity to discover something within us that we never thought was possible. She teaches that we cannot choose to live or to have a life free of hurt, but we can choose to be free and to escape the past, no matter what befalls us, and embrace the possible. We have to make that choice to be free. Victimization happens to us, but it is we who choose to label ourselves as victims. If it is we who decide we are victims, well, that means it is we who can decide that we are not. A few weeks ago in our Torah, we read a list of all sorts of curses, terrible things that will happen to the Israelites when they enter the land if they do not walk in God's ways. And there are some really terrible things, but the very last curse, the culmination of all of them, is lo ta'amin b'chayecha. You will not believe in your life. In other words, all the many curses listed before lo ta'amin b'chayecha are not as bad as the perspective you might have on your life, a perspective that is void of belief and of faith. The Torah teaches us that we have the most important superpower that there is, and it is the power of choice. Re'eh anochi noten lifnechem hayom bracha uklala. See here this day, I set before you a choice to choose blessing or curse, to decide how you will walk through life. Choose life, we will hear in our Torah tomorrow morning, so that you may live. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live for can endure almost any how." We must ask ourselves, what is our why? What is our Everest? And our why should contain several ingredients: passion, genuine curiosity, love, and a yes to the question, if no one were watching, would I still do it? There are 4-minute mile barriers in all our lives. What are they in yours? What seems impossible, but may not be yet? While you are misusing your energy believing it can't be done, the Roger Bannisters of the world are busy getting it done. Who would you rather be? I believe that when the heart is true, the universe will conspire to support us. What is your Everest? Today is the day to answer that question, before the gates close and you head into another year. Will it be a year half empty or half full? Will you choose blessing or will you choose life? In the concentration camp of Theresienstadt, the prisoners built an underground synagogue so they could pray and connect spiritually. In the midst of a labor death camp with so many obstacles and struggles, they spent their efforts and energy building an underground synagogue. And why? Because they could. Because it mattered to them. Because in the midst of the impossible, they were determined for this to be possible. They were committed to connecting themselves to something bigger than that moment in time. That death-ridden, horrific moment in time became, for those prisoners, about something bigger. It became about blessing, a place where they could bless, of all things, bless, and express gratitude, and that is how they survived. That underground synagogue represented hope and faith and possibility. So I'll close with this. Here's the thing about choice. It always involves risk. But risk is a synonym for faith. And if you are taking a risk, then what you're really saying is that you have faith in the new day, and that new day is tomorrow, with all the possibilities it brings, and that you plan to be a part of it. If you dare nothing, then when the day is over, nothing is all you will have gained. I set before you the choice of blessing and curse on this holiest of days. As we look towards a new year, which will you choose? Or as my rabbi, Mary Oliver, so beautifully penned, tell me, what do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Good Yom Tov.